Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to session 4, Military Practices 1. I feel very happy, very obliged that I'm chairing this session because it features two people who I know very well and consider friends, and whose scholarship I admire very much, apart from Joseph Roisman's. And this is Yossi and Angelos, who are going to be talking about generals. And I think this actually gets to the very core of some of the things we've been talking about today, a different way, and that is we've been looking at sources and what they tell us about the workings of democracy in the military, and they, to judge from their abstracts, because I haven't really read the papers, sorry, are doing the opposite, and that is democracy informing the sources, and particularly military rehabilitation. And I think that's going to be quite interesting and important. So our first speaker doesn't need any introduction. Professor Emeritus Joseph Roisman has published a large number of works, and if you really want to call him what type of man he is the general's man, because his first book was on Demosthenes the Strategos, published a very large book on Athenian generals, and he's currently writing a book on Alexander's friends for Disney, which is really good. But today we invite him to talk about generals and generalship in the 4th century orators.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. And thank you and thank David for inviting me, and my wife Hannah, and for doing such a wonderful thing. I'm sure I'm talking to many of us. This is a work in progress, so if you're still awake at the end of the paper, please, I welcome your comments on anything that I'm going to say. Images of Athenian generals in Attic order. Am I said normal? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Reflect both the orators and the audience's perception of the office and of the individuals who held it. Generalship ranked among the top state magistracies, conferring power, respectability, eminence, and prestige. Its holders were judged by their military records, but also, and sometimes more often, by their personal backgrounds, character, conduct, public and private. There could be harmony and tension between the public's high regard for the office and the opinion of its occupiers. Furthermore, the power and dignity that came with generalship gave rise to apprehension, but also anxieties about the men who held it. This range of feeling engenders both positive and, among the orators, more commonly negative rhetorical images of generals. Mixed portraits are very rare. This paper deals with pejorative images of generals and their rhetorical manipulations in the corpus of the Attic orators. In particular, it focuses on what can be called the, quote, blended general, end quote, motif in the deliberative and forensic oratory. So on to bad generals. Positive portrayals of generals in Attic oratory often found their models in famous generals of the past. In contrast, images of bad generals tended to rely on comparison with more recent commanders. Broadly speaking, the orators presented the bad general as harming the city instead of benefiting it. His most obvious faults were defeats and failure to accomplish military goals. He might lose men and equipment, lose her armed Athens allies and overseas territories, or damage its honor and reputation. Many Athenians defined these folly laws as betrayals of the city and its allies. Such treason, with or without the politician's help, could also endanger Athens' democratic constitution. Other accounts of bad generals describe the impact of their personal defects on their conduct in office. They could be corrupt or corrupting, stealing and misusing public funds. More generally, they placed their private interests ahead of the common good. Finally, bad generals abused or flaunted their power and failed to abide by the rules that defined their authority. Demosthenes referred to the frequency of successful impeachment as Angelia trials against generals in Athens and Megan Hansen ensured that the orator does not exaggerate. Most impeachment trials in 425 to 355 BCE were on charges of corruption and treason. We cannot judge the validity of the charges, but their high recurrence suggests that public opinion was receptive to such accusations. Such litigation also encouraged distrust of the city leadership, including generals. And with very few exceptions, Athenians seem to agree in attributing military failures to generals alone, and never to the poor performance of the Athenians under their command. In his funeral oration for the dead of Chaeronea, Demosthenes made sure to deny the people's culpability for the defeat. Quote, "And when the leaders of the enemies, namely Philip, overcame those in charge of our army, no one can fairly blame the rank and files of either the enemy or ours." End of quote. Speaker may also blame fate, and when it served their rhetorical needs, they assign partial or full responsibility for the losses and their consequences to political advisors. Yet more often, the generals alone were blamed for the failures and the shame that they incurred. Two orators took exception to blame the general role. The earlier of them, Isocrates, admits that there were generals who did wrong, but criticized the people for electing criminals and unqualified men to the office, or claims that the generals were only implementing a bad or unfair policy that they did not make. Demosthenes develops this notion of shared blame into a recurrent theme of his public speeches. Without fully exonerating the generals, he greatly extenuated their culpability by blaming the demos for the poor state of Athens' affairs, of which the bad general was more a symptom than a cause. Thus, he criticized the generals for lying and making false promises, for staying home and not fighting, and for shunning the risk of battle. He alleges that they fought for their own advantage rather than for the city, that they attacked Athens' allies for personal gain, and that they ignored the assembly's orders. Demosthenes argues that many of these wrongdoings were either forced upon the generals or were tolerated by the people. For example, he complained that the demos did not supply the generals with funds sufficient to pay their mercenary troops, with the result that the mercenaries hired themselves to other patrons instead of fighting the city's war. Lacking financial support from the city, the generals were forced to extort money from allies, friends, and seafarers. They made false reports and promises because the people had unrealistic expectations. At one point, Demosthenes directly attacks the popular blaming of generals. In his speech, in his reproach of the Athenians for their mismanagement of their conflict with Philip, he compares them to a deserter who blamed the generals or fellow soldier for a defeat, but not himself. Even when the generals did wrong, the people mishandled their control over them, failing to supervise the generals' conduct overseas and allowing them to escape justice at home. They let the generals abuse them and enjoy all the benefits of public office. They gave them undeserved credit and honor for the people's exploits. Finally, they issued empty decrees and voted big forces that never materialized. Now, Demosthenes, as we heard today from Professor Gerbeson, probably exaggerated the dysfunction of the state in order to justify his proposal that citizens contribute more in money and personal services, and that public office holders be better supervised. In his portrayal, bad generalship is due less to the individual who hold it, unworthy as he may be, than to more systematic failure. So far, the images of generals in the oratorio, the bad general, the good generals is a little bit another story, and I don't talk about it because I don't have time. So, blaming the people for the general's failure was less useful in courts of law, where it could be antagonized jurors and jeopardize the speaker. Two speeches, one ascribed to Lysias and the other written by Apollodorus, son of Persion, avoid impugning the people and allege that generals maltreated the speakers, their subordinates. As might be expected, these presentations of generals are tendentious and at times misleading. In what follows, I examine the general's conflict with the speakers from the general's point of view. That is my perspective, not from the speaker's point of view, but how the generals would view the conflict. And that is in the hope of understanding the nature of Athenian military command, why these generals acted as they did, and whether they were as bad as described. The speech entitled For the Soldier, number 9 in Lysias Corpus, was written for an Athenian probably named Polyaenus, who was prosecuted for an unpaid fine, a charge punishable by confiscation of property, apocryphae. It's a short speech, dated to the early 4th century, and it's attributing to Lysias is in doubt. According to Polyaenus, the suit against him originated in the generals calling him up for service, even though he had already served his term, and in contravention of the rule against enlisting men who had served recently. Polyaenus went to see the generals with proof that supported this claim, but was allegedly rebuffed in an insulting manner and even threatened with imprisonment. Later, the generals found out that Polyaenus had insulted them at the bank desk, and then imposed a fine for slander on him. That was against the law to slander generals. Thus, according to Polyaenus, the generals both started the conflict and then made it worse. Yet questions arise. Did they arrest the soldier as they could have? No. Did they bring him to court during the term of office for not paying the fine? No. Was the fine ever collected? No. In other words, the generals only threatened or tried to exert pressure on soldiers to enlist. The reluctance to escalate the conflict and take a meaningful punitive action, at least until the trial under discussion, was part of the negotiation tactics with the soldier. They needed them in the ranks, and we heard today that there was demand for the soldiers, and wished to give him an opportunity to change his mind before their term ended. They also sought to avoid an unnecessary quarrel with a man who possessed the self-confidence to confront them and was associated with a powerful and well-known public figure named Sostratos. We show the conflict at risk provoking Polyaenus to bring charge against them when they gave their accounts or in other procedures that could lead to prosecution. So if I'm right in seeing the general's conduct as reactive and restrained, it explained why the soldier speechwriter had to offset it by making them the villains of the story, applying and modifying images of bad generals to the case. In addition to the use of improper legal maneuvers, the speech asserts, they abused their office to mistreat and insult the soldier. They persecuted him not in public interest, but because of personal hatred, and they sought to benefit personally from their unjust action. They thought little of democracy or the gods and behaved lawlessly and violently. In reality, the general's actions belie their intimidating portrait and suggest not an abuse of authority, but self-imposed limits on their power. The rest of the paper deals more at length with another speech. It's an Apollodorus speech in which he charged his general with maltreating him. Apollodorus was an orator and a public figure whose extant speeches were erroneously attributed to Demosthenes. And the speech against Polycles, or Pseudo-Demosthenes number 50, is a prosecution speech against the Athenian Polycles, who was meant to replace Apollodorus as a triarch, but did not. Apollodorus accuses Polycles of showing up for duty much later than ordered, and of refusing to take over the ship and to reimburse him for the expenses Apollodorus had incurred since the end of his term of his office. In 360 of 359, Apollodorus sued Polycles for the expenses. Much of Apollodorus' speech, to those who read it familiar with that, is basically a self-praising portrait of a model citizen, namely Apollodorus, who spared no effort or money in making himself the top triarch and his triumph the top ship. I do not intend to deal with the merits of his or his opponent's case, but to focus instead on his depiction of the generals. Even though they play only a secondary and mostly negative role in the speech, there's enough in it to allow reading the case from their perspective. The speech narrates Apollo's services from 362 to 360 under three generals, Eudocles, Menon, and Timomachus, the last of whom Apollodorus singles out for accusations. Apollodorus and his ship operated in the northern Aegean, Thrace and the Hellespont, in response to heavy demands on the Athenian navy, demands to intervene. The size of his squadron, based in Tarsus, is unknown. George Cockrell estimates that the Athenians had only 40 to 50 ships in active service in this period. True or not, the general had limited number of ships at their disposal, and the need for every one of them to be functional, which was the triarch's responsibility, constrained their relationship and bargaining power vis-à-vis the triarchs. Apollodorus first mentioned the generals when he details their large expenses in getting the best equipment and his large expenses in getting the best equipment and best expert seamen for a ship. He then justifies the sale of desertion, and by the way, they deserted more time, Apollodorus, than all other triarchs in the navy. Not a great distinction. Anyway, so he justified their desertion on the grounds that he ran out of money to pay them. Among the contributors to his distress was the general's failure to support him financially, even though he conceded that they gave him money for rations, insufficiently in his view, as well as wages for 2 months out of 17 months triarchy. He also alleges that the crews left him because they didn't trust the generals, a likely reference to the general's unkept promises of future payments. Apollodorus' complaints are largely credible. Athenian generals' financial difficulties and the various means of addressing them are amply attested and been widely discussed, especially by Professor Vincent Gabrielson. Also authentic is Apollodorus' perspective of the general demands. He says that despite the desertions he suffered, the lack of financial aid from the generals, and the expiration of his triarchy, the general Timomachus kept assigning him different missions, which Apollodorus beautifully and successfully accomplished. Apollodorus' hardship aside, there was nothing exceptional in what he was asked to do. After all, Timomachus had to use the ships available to him, regardless of the triarch's trouble. Apollodorus' account, however, depicts the general as ever demanding, imperious, and inconsiderate, in contrast with Apollodorus' self-portrait as an obedient, self-sacrificing triarch. Apollodorus also presents himself as the city's benefactor, while obscuring Timomachus' service. Among Timomachus' concerns was securing the transport of grain from Hieron on the Black Sea to Athens. Cities on the grain ships' route to Athens forced them to upload their cargo at their ports, leading to scarcity and high prices in Athens. Timomachus accordingly sent triremes to Hieron, Apollodorus was among them, to escort the grain ships home. Apollodorus says nothing about the effectiveness of his action, of Timomachus' action. But we know it succeeded because later in the speech, Apollodorus takes sole credit for bringing grain to the city. During the speech, Apollodorus described his several successful attempts to get Polycles, his successor, to take over the ship and pay Apollodorus' expenses for the extra time he served as triarch. 2 of the challenges were made in the presence of the general, who took no action. By now many jurors must have asked themselves why Timomachus did not come to Apollodorus' aid. Apollodorus' answer, accepted by modern readers, is that Timomachus took Polycles' side, his opponent's side. Yet the general's refusal to intervene did not necessarily mean that he favored one side or the other. Timomachus needed an operative ship with a triarch to maintain it, both of which he could obtain without getting involved in the dispute between the triarchs, since Apollodorus had to continue his triarchy as long as the dispute remained in its impasse. On the other hand, if Polycles agreed to Apollodorus' terms, Polycles would be in charge. In either case, Timomachus would have the ship and its triarch available to service. Non-intervention was attractive also because it avoided the risk of alienating either side. Both Apollodorus and Polycles were rich and politically ambitious, and conflict with either could have repercussions at home, as indeed happened when Apollodorus prosecuted the generals under whom he served, including Timomachus. So pragmatism and vulnerability, therefore, encouraged the general to stay out of the feud, if possible. Unfortunately for Apollodorus, the solution worked in his disfavor. Hence his continuing pressure on the general to force Polycles to take over the ship, and his accusation of conspiratorial agreement between the general and against him, when Timomachus refused to comply. According to Apollodorus, Timomachus did not compel Polycles to take over the ship, quote, even though the laws on the matter are strict, end of quote. The statement is problematic. The laws Apollodorus had in mind are likely the, quote, the very severe laws, end of quote, mentioned later in the speech, which punished triarchs who failed to take over the ship from their predecessor at the appointed time. It is hard to imagine, however, that the laws forced the timely exchange of triarch in all circumstances, such as delays due to sickness, bad weather, or as in this case, unresolved financial dispute between the triarchs and their successor. Polycles and another court triarch mentioned by Apollodorus was also late to replace his predecessor, and whom Apollodorus praised for reimbursing the latter's debt, are examples of triarchs who did not take over their ships in time and were not penalized. In any case, the laws, whether observed or violated, concerned the obligations of triarchs, not of the general, who had no legal obligation to force Polycles to take over the ship. Nonetheless, Apollodorus charged that Timomachus failed to follow the laws and had rhetorical power. The general was meant to act as the enforcer or restorer of order against individuals, such as Polycles, who undermined it. Timomachus' alleged refusal to uphold the laws was disorderly, unfair, even undemocratic, all symptoms of bad generalship as described by the orators. Apollodorus goes on to explain the general's inaction. He first alleges that Timomachus did not want the change of the triarchs to happen because he knew that Polycles would make a terrible triarch and his triumph would be poorly equipped and staffed. The scenario is wholly hypothetical and designed both to malign his opponent and invite a flattering comparison with Apollodorus himself. Equally hypothetical and slanderous is Timomachus' alleged other motive, namely his expectation that Polycles would disobey his order when he became triarch to sail unless the general gave him money. More authentic, however, is the premise that in the negotiation between a strong-willed and disobedient triarch and a strapped-for-cash general, the latter was in a weaker position. Such weakness was another reason for Timomachus to avoid a dispute between his triarchs. Sensing perhaps that he needed a more persuasive explanation of Timomachus' refusal to make Polycles take over the ship, Apollodorus adduced the all-too-common benefit motive, claiming that Polycles loaned Timomachus 3,000 drachmas on the condition that the general would not force him to take over the ship. Of the Athenian loans known to me, no contract had a comparable stipulation conditioning a loan on the lender's inaction. Moreover, Apollodorus never says how he found out about the loan, nor does he provide supporting evidence from witnesses who normally attested such transaction. When you give someone a loan, you like to have witnesses. Instead, he makes the loan look suspiciously like a bribe or an illegal purchase of relief from triarchy. We may therefore entertain doubts about the authenticity of the loan, and even more about the condition Apollodorus alleges. Apollodorus' next primary explanation of Timomachus' conduct and hostility toward him is a variant of the rhetoric of conspiracy, a subject that I've discussed elsewhere in regard to other cases. It involved the exiled Athenian politician Callistratos, who had been condemned to death in absentia. According to Apollodorus, Callistratos sent Timomachus, his in-law, a letter requesting his fastest ship to take him from Methone on the Macedonian coast to Timomachus in Tarsus. So he wanted him to send him a fast ship. Timomachus chose Apollodorus and the ship for the voyage and put the Athenian Callippus, probably his officer or agent, in charge of the ship. Apollodorus claimed that he was kept in the dark about the true purpose of the trip until the sailor told him about it on the way to Macedonia. Apollodorus then told Callippus in no uncertain terms that he would not transport the exile, because the laws forbade and punished with death the crime of harboring of a condemned exile. Is Apollodorus right about the illegality of Timomachus' order? Scholars believe so, and maintain that Apollodorus' later prosecution of the general included Timomachus' aid to Callistratos. Yet the unlawfulness of Timomachus' order was not as unequivocal as Apollodorus alleges in the present speech and perhaps in Timomachus' later trial. Apollodorus suggests the criminal nature of the mission by presenting it as a clandestine effort to bring Callistratos to Tarsus without telling him. So we are asked to believe that when Timomachus' agent Callippus came to take charge of the ship and told the pilot to sail Macedonia, Apollodorus never asked him, why are we going there and where exactly in Macedonia we are going? Did he really learn about it from the first time when the ship stopped for a meal break and the sailor informed him about the trip's goal? Apollodorus may have known more than he cared to tell. Later, when confronting Callippus about taking Callistratos on board, Callippus, the agent, made no effort to hide his purpose and insisted instead on completing the mission. When Apollodorus returned to Tarsus, he told everyone who cared to listen about what happened, and Timomachus, with no attempt at concealment, arranged for another trip to bring Callistratos over. Thus, there was no underhanded attempt by the general to commit a crime. There may not even been a crime, because at least Timomachus and Callippus, and perhaps even the Athenian who rented his trial key to Callippus for the second attempt to bring Callistratos, seems to find nothing wrong with bringing him to Tarsus. Indeed, Apollodorus carefully avoided telling us why Callistratos needed the ship to Tarsus, and why Timomachus was so keen on helping him. He only insinuates that Timomachus did it for private reasons, by adding that Callistratos was Timomachus' in-law. There may be even another explanation. In 360, shortly after the events just described, Callistratos was involved as an oikistes, as a founder, or in some other capacity, in the Tarsian foundation of Datos in Thrace. Datos was later renamed Cronides and later Philippi. Datos was a settlement rich in agriculture and minerals, and therefore potentially of interest to Athens and definitely to Tarsus. Did the law about harboring and hosting condemned exiles apply also to cases where the exiles wished to help the state or its ally? I suggest that Apollodorus had a choice between obeying and disobeying Timomachus' order, and that he chose the latter to disobey him not only on legal grounds, but also because he could pay back. And with this round, and win this round of power struggle with the general. Apollodorus therefore told Callippus that he would take the ship not to Macedonia, but back to the generals in Tarsus. His refusal led to a heated argument over whose orders the ship's pilot should follow. Those of Callippus, who wanted the ship to sail to Macedonia, or those of Apollodorus, who wanted to go to Tarsus. Now, as the commander of the ship, a representative of the general, Callippus clearly had the greater authority. For that reason, Apollodorus reframes the dispute by moving it from the military to the economic sphere. In this account, the pilot is directly quoted as saying that Apollodorus would answer for himself in his forthcoming mutiny, giving an account, but that the pilot would follow Apollodorus' orders because he paid his wages. Along with Apollodorus' refusal to sail to Macedonia, the statement clearly illustrates the power of money in the context between the general and his triarch. In other words, money talks. The aftermath of the episode reinforces the lesson. Upon his return to Thassos, Apollodorus was summoned to the general's headquarters. Fearing arrest, probably for failing to transport Callistratos, he again disobeyed Timomachos, letting the general know that if he wanted to talk, he could meet him in the agora. There was no good reason why the general could not arrest him in the agora. But Apollodorus wanted to turn the disagreement into a public scandal and was probably ready to resist arrest there. Thus, Apollodorus had his little victories, and Timomachos let him pass, instead of putting his foot down or punishing him. It appears that the general and his defined triarch then reached a compromise or established a working relationship. They may even have reconciled, since Timomachos sailed to the Hellespont aboard Apollodorus' ship, which was the kind of use he wished to make of it all along. He also had the last word, because Apollodorus could not go home without his permission, risking harsh penalties for desertion if he did so. When the general did send him home, Timomachos put an officer, Lucinus, in charge of the ship and instructed him to pay the crew. When the ship reached the island of Tenedos, Lucinus said that he didn't have the money and he would get it elsewhere. Apollodorus ended up taking out another loan to pay his men. I do not think that Timomachos tricked Apollodorus when he sent him away with the men who couldn't pay the sailors. Not even Apollodorus states that. It is more likely that Timomachos tried to help Apollodorus by passing on his own and Apollodorus' financial obligation to someone else. The failure of his solution was no longer his problem. But Apollodorus would have his revenge. When he returned to Athens, and probably after his legal action against Polycles, he impeached Timomachos in charge of treason, mishandling of money, and perhaps his dealing with Callistratos. Timomachos did not wait for his trial, but went into exile and was condemned to death in absentia. In sum, it was Timomachos' unenvious lot to deal with two feuding triarchs. He chose the way of least confrontation rather than threatening them with the law or his authority. Even when he did make the threats, he did not pursue them. His reluctance to force a solution, partially to ignore Apollodorus' challenges, to his authority, was similar to the general's policy in the case described in Lysias 9 for the soldier. Not surprisingly, Apollodorus had his own view of the general's conduct. His resentment and sense of wrong found expression in the image of bad generals that are also found in other speakers. He charged Timomachos with failing to provide money and to enforce military regulations. He accuses the general of being inconsiderate of the men under his command and of dealing with them in a corrupt, partisan way. He charges him of colluding with bad citizens, of prioritizing private over public interest, and of violating the laws of the city. Because Apollodorus' case was against Polycles, he said nothing about Timomachos' military competence, probably saving the kind of criticism for a later trial of the general. Now, in her excellent publication, Traditionnellement Democracy, Claude Mossé identified a new type of general in 4th century Athens. Earlier generals were more political leaders than commanders, but later classical period saw the rise of such professional soldiers such as Timotheus, Iphicrates, Gabrias, Chares, all of them men of wealth, power, and influence. They had domestic and foreign allies that increasingly allowed them to free themselves, relatively speaking, from the city's authority. Mossé's characterization of these men is fairly accurate, but I believe that Timomachos and the generals in the Lysias speeches were more representative of the office. However we may assess Timomachos' generalship, Apollodorus' speech showed that he worked under severe constraints that affected his performance and authority. For him and other commanders, the road to rich fame and even good generalship was blocked by the city's inconsistent policy, poor or limited financial and human resources, and by their own subordinates. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to introduce another dear friend of mine who puts us all to shame with his output. I have emailed Angelos at so many different times of the day and night, my time, and there is a reply within minutes, so I don't think this guy sleeps, which is not a surprise when it's an odd week when he doesn't publish a book. He is at the Academy of Athens for this year. He is a noted authority, of course, on so many things, just like our previous speaker, of course, Roisman, but in particular Xenophon, the Greek orators. I had the pleasure of contributing a chapter to Angelos' most recent edited book on the orator's use of the past, published by De Gruyter, and I immediately had our library buy 2 copies, so the royalties should flow your way soon. And like all of Angelos' work, it's so thick. Anything thinner, it mustn't be him, it must be a fake. We are here to listen to him talk about the rehabilitation of Conon, and again, as I was saying before, this is the democracy, if you like, influencing our sources, which I think is a nice twist. So Angelos, if you'd like to kick off with From Villain to Hero, Conon's victory at Cnidus in the Attic Orators.
Good evening, everybody. I know you are tired. Ask for your favor a few more minutes. I have asked to take some handouts just to have a general outline of the text that I'm going to investigate. So, the problem is with the general Conon. From villain to hero, Conon's victory at Cnidus in the Attic Orators. Claude Mossé has argued that because of Athens' financial and military problems after its defeat at the Gospotami, a new type of leadership emerged, that of the commander of mercenaries, and thus was more independent from his city. Athens' inability to control its generals made the victories of Philip and Alexander inevitable. On the other hand, Mossé traced the uneasy relationship between Athens and the general Conon, who tried to revive Athenian imperialism after the Gospotami through the help of the Agoras, and most of all of Persia. This incident is a gap in her analysis. In this paper, I will investigate Conon's service under Persia, his victory at Cnidus, and the response of the Athenian orators to this event from the moment of the naval engagement until 322. I shall argue that almost all the orators did not see positively Conon's cooperation with Persia, but after the creation of the Second Athenian League, when the Athenians had aspirations of a revival of their hegemony, they saw Conon in a positive light. As the time passed and the Athenians' real knowledge of the historical past faded away, Conon's image became even more positive. In the meantime, Conon's son Timotheus made some serious military success during the Second Confederacy, so the Athenians connected him with his father and the victory at Cnidus. First, the historical facts. Conon at Cyprus and his contact with Persia. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War at the Gospotami, but Conon escaped and went to Evagoras in Cyprus, becoming a self-exiled man and stopping being an Athenian general. Then he asked the king as a freelancer to help him fight Sparta, having Evagoras' support. Conon went to the king and promised him that he would utterly destroy the Lacedaemonians if he furnished him with money, and made the rest of the preparations according to his own preference. Artaxerxes shared Conon's enthusiasm and confidence that he would achieve a great victory against Sparta, appointed a steward who would provide the money that Conon would ask, but he would share the leadership of his fleet with Pharnabazus. The moves of the Athenians. The Athenians, although they had surrendered their city to Sparta, were still thinking in an imperialistic way in 395. They sent weapons and crews to Conon's ships and 3 ambassadors to the king who were captured by the general Navarchpharax and were put to death. More important, Dimenetus launched a trireme from the Piraeus, intending to sail to Conon. The Athenians disavowed Dimenetus' actions in the assembly and denounced him to Milon, the Spartan commander at Aegina, who pursued him, but he managed to escape and went to Conon. This imperialistic ambition became more concrete afterwards because the people decided to get involved in a war against Sparta. Conon, the Persian fleet, and the naval battle at Cnidus. Conon led a Greek contingent, which was part of the Persian fleet and faced the Spartan commander Pisander, who was killed while fighting on his ship. This was the victory of the Athenian commander against the Spartan one. Conon, Pharnabazus, and the liberation of the Greeks. Then Conon freed the Greeks from Sparta, having Pharnabazus' support. He convinced him to leave the Greek autonomous, keep the fleet by raising funds from the islands, sail to Athens and rebuild the walls, an act that would be grievous to the Spartans. Then he brought over the Cyclades to his cause, sailed against Scythia and went to Corinth. The Lacedaemonians lost the sovereignty of the sea. Some Greeks greeted the victory at Cnidus as Conon's personal achievement. The people of Erythrae set up a stele with a decree which said that it made him benefactor and proxenos, offered special privileges to him and his descendants, and put up a gilt statue in the shrine of the deity Aphrodite Pontia. Samos and Ephesus also made statues for Conon. Conon's return to Athens and the reaction of the Athenians. Conon returned to Athens, erected a large portion of the wall, offering his own men and spending Persia's money. The Athenians and some others had rebuilt a part of the wall, but did not continue out of the lack of money, waiting for Conon's return. Conon presented his victory as Greek by convincing the Athenians in 393 to honor Evagoras with a statue. Moreover, in a decree which was published in front of the image of Zeus Eleftherios in the Agora, the Athenians claimed that Evagoras was fighting as a Greek on behalf of the Greeks, who gained freedom in place of slavery because of the victory at Cnidus. The Athenians also celebrated Conon's victory at Cnidus as a Greek one, responding to the honors that other Greek cities had already offered him. They set up his statue next to that of Evagoras, a great honor because Conon became the first living Athenian to be honored with a statue in that place. In addition, in the first quarter of the 4th century, before the conclusion of the king's peace, the Athenians erected a pedestal in his honor in the Acropolis, added an inscription which mentioned his name, and created spaces which serve as platforms for the exhibition of some of the trophies won in battle by Conon. Sparta's response. When the Spartans heard that Conon was using the king's money to rebuild the walls, maintain his fleet, and win over to the Athenian side the islands and the cities on the mainland, they sent Antalcidas to Tiribazus, the king's general, and accused Conon. In response, the Athenians sent Conon, whom they considered the most competent to deal with the Persians, while other ambassadors went with him. Antalcidas proposed that the Greeks should accept Persia's claim to the Asiatic Greeks and that all other islands and cities should be autonomous. Conon and the ambassadors did not agree because they were afraid that Athens would lose the islands of Limnos, Imbros, and Scios. In the end, no agreement was reached. Tiribazus, who was afraid of Conon's naval success and believed that he would influence the king in favor of Athens, imprisoned him, and informed the king that Conon had wronged him. Conon must have escaped from prison, took refuge in Cyprus of Agoras, and died there of sickness. After the meeting at Sardis, the Spartans made a congress in their city in 392, in which they offered Athens the right to keep Limnos, Ibros, and Skyros. The Athenians sent ambassadors, among them the orators and Dosides, who tried to convince their fellow citizens to accept a peace. But the Athenians rejected the Spartan terms and convicted their ambassadors to death because they hoped they could reclaim their former leadership in the Greek world because of Conon's victory. A little later, the Athenians accepted the peace of Andalkidas because he prevented the grain ships from sailing to Athens, and thus the people would face famine. The reaction of the orators towards Conon's deeds. This fact led the Athenians to be uneasy about Conon's victory at Cnidus and its results, since the king ruled the Greek affairs. Their reaction to the new situation is reflected in their rhetorical speeches. All orators were reluctant to refer to Conon in a positive way, except for one, Polycrates, who says in his fictitious speech accusation against Socrates that the walls were rebuilt by Conon 6 years after Socrates' death. Polycrates praised Conon for the rebuilding of the walls in order to justify the restored democracy, its statesmen, and Socrates' execution. Conon was considered a true democratic man, and his example should convince the Athenians to convince Socrates once again. A totally negative picture of Conon appears in the other orators. First come Andosides on peace. The speech is probably a revised text of the original text, or a rhetorical exercise, but it is useful for understanding of Conon's rhetorical image. Andosides is too much concerned with the walls. He admits that the Spartans forced the Athenians to demolish them because of the truce between the two cities, whereas under the present terms they can rebuild them. He says that the peace gives them the right to build the walls, and then asks, who turned the king of Persia against Sparta? Who enabled Conon to fight the engagement at sea which lost their maritime supremacy? Andosides means that the Athenians themselves turned the king to an anti-Spartan policy, and that they helped Conon to fight Sparta at sea. This is a provocative statement, because Conon's initiative to convince the king to begin hostilities with Sparta was his own. Andosides' reaction could reflect discussions in Athens, which argued that since Athens had sent a ship and armed to Conon, and many Athenians had been in favor of the Mennetus movement, the success of Conon should not be bestowed on him, but on the city. Then Andosides names Conon as the man who defeated Sparta, but he refuses to name the place in which the battle took place. That is, he follows a common tactic through which the orators downplayed a defeat, but not in favor of Athens, but of Sparta. Andosides continues his arguments against the contemporary situation in Athens. He says that the Spartans give walls to the Athenians, and that if Athens has walls in the future, which implies that they do not have them at that time, and claims that if the Athenians want to acquire walls, they must get them themselves, which implies that they do not have them right now. Andosides knew that what he said was a mistake, but did he not share the imperialistic feelings of the Athenian, which were stronger now because of the refortification of the city? Lysias mentions Conon twice in speech 19. First, he says that Conon had acted as a general around the Peloponnese. This is not accurate, because Conon was not an Athenian general when he went to Cyprus, while the king allowed him to lead the Persian fleet along with Pharnabazus. Moreover, Lysias does not define the time when Conon assumed these duties, for what reason and by whom. We know that Conon had sailed in that area after the Battle of Cnidus. Obviously, Lysias did not want to mention it. Then Lysias says that Conon won the naval battle which occurred in the archonship of Eubulides. That is, he defines the time that Conon was victorious through the archonship of that year, but he did not feel comfortable to connect him with the victory at Cnidus by naming him. Lysias is also negative to Conon in his funeral speech, which purports to honor those who died assisting the Athenians during the Corinthian War of 395-387. The speech, which is a representative example of the epitaphic genre, reflects something from the general opinion of the Athenians about Conon and his role with Persia. In 259, Lysias says that Other became leader of those who had not previously manned a fleet, defeated the Greeks in a naval battle, sailed to Europe and are enslaving the cities of the Greeks. Lysias does not name either Conon and Pharnabazus or the battle, but it could be him as a commander of the Persian fleet in the Battle of Cnidus. This is not seen as a defeat of Sparta by its adversaries, Athens included, but rather as a defeat of Greeks by Persians. Moreover, the Greek cities which were liberated must be those after Cnidus, which is seen as the triumph of Persians over Greeks, not Spartans. In 260, Lysias says that the king rejoices and has taken on other leaders. The orators uses plural number, but this could be Conon. In 263, he says that the Democrats rebuilt the walls which had been demolished. Namely, he relocates the rebuilding of the walls in an anachronistic way, regarding it as one of the best achievements of the democratic counter-revolutionaries in 303-400. Given that the Athenians had begun working on the walls before Conon's arrivals, Lysias deprives Conon's major contribution to the project because he was not happy with the fact that Conon had served with the Persian navy. Given that the funeral orators were hostile to Persia, and Lysias has narrated in detail Athens' role in the great battles against Persia, a negative treatment of Conon was to be expected. Isocrates does not mention Conon in his decanic speech Trapeziticus. He presents a Bosporan metic who lived in Athens, saying that he did not want to put his money at risk on a voyage to Bosporus in 394, because the Spartans were ruling the sea at the time. Isocrates makes this claim about the Lacedaemonians, while the Dicasts knew that Conon had defeated them because he did not want to remind them of Conon's cooperation with Persia. Plato is negative towards Conon's role in his Menexenus. The current event for which Socrates delivers his speech is the Corinthian War. So it is plausible to believe that Plato represents popular opinion at Athens at the time of the king's speech. Plato warns his readers that although Socrates offers a speech which resembles that of the genre, he aims at pleasure and laughter. Conon's cooperation with Persia is part of the game. Claiming that Athens has always been compassionate to excess and the handmaid of the weak, Socrates ironically says that Athens could not help the king officially, being ashamed of the trophies of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, but she permitted only exiles and volunteers to assist him, namely Conon. Then, Socrates says that Athens, having restored her walls and rebuilt her navy, entered the Corinthian War. Plato presents Athens responsible for the reconstruction of its fleet and its fortifications, and ignores the contribution of the Persians and Conon's role in it. Moreover, Socrates says that valiant were those who rescued the king and drove the Lacedaemonians off the sea. Plato alludes to Conon's cooperation with the king and Pharnabazus before and after Cnidus, as Lysias did in his own funeral speech. Although he acknowledges that Conon was a freelancer, he chooses not to name him, following the other orators disapprove of his dependence on Persia. Moreover, he becomes ironical by calling Conon agathon, which was a term used for the citizens who achieved victory for their fatherland. In his panegyricus, Isocrates avoids mentioning Conon and says vaguely that after the defeat of Athens at Aegospotami, other leaders took charge. The Persians defeated the Athenians in a naval battle, ruled the sea, subdued most of the islands, landed in Spartan territory, took Kythera by force, and sailed all around the Peloponnese, wreaking havoc as they went. Isocrates alludes to Conon's cooperation with Pharnabazus in a way that recalls Lysias in his funeral speech almost verbatim. Second, he claims that if the Persian fleet had been under the king's control, it would have disbanded on many occasions. However, because of his commander, who is Conon, but Isocrates does not name again, he achieved a naval victory, but just barely. Third, he says that Conon acted as a general for the benefit of Asia, and thus ruined the power of Persia. Now Isocrates explicitly mentions Conon, making clear that cooperation with the Persians because they punished him with death. The Second Athenian League, Timotheus and Conon. The king's speech in 387-6 did not restrict alliances, so Athens could found the Second Athenian Confederacy in 377. The allies would be free and autonomous, and Athens would protect them from Sparta. There must also have been a reference to the king's speech, because the Athenians wanted to exculpate themselves from their acceptance of the peace they had signed. The general Iphicrates and Timotheus, Conon's son, played a decisive role in the creation and maintenance of the league. One of the military moves of Timotheus was to sail around the Peloponnese in 375, as his father had done after the victory at Cnidus. In addition, and this was his most important success, Timotheus defeated the Spartans at Alesia and thus contributed to the consolidation of the Confederacy. The Athenians set up Timotheus' statue in the Acropolis at the site of the existing statue of his father and added the inscription Timotheus Kononos. Moreover, they added one more monument in the Agora, which represented father and son. The kinship of the two men and their victories over the Spartans helped the Athenians present the period from the victory at Cnidus to the victory at Alesia as a consistent process. What followed in Athenian politics was not favorable to the city. Athens lost the social war in 357-56, lost the battle at Chaeronea, and accepted the Macedonian rule until the Harpagus affair and the exiles' decree. What remained as a recurrent theme in the orators were the victories of Conon and Timotheus. The response of the orators. The orators responded focusing on Conon's achievement at Cnidus and praised Timotheus along his father. Isocrates offers in Evagoras a selective but positive image of Conon, shifts the focus from Persia, and presents the victory at Cnidus as an Athenian victory. He praises Conon for cooperating with Evagoras and maintains that when the Spartans tried to damage Persia, the two men seized the opportunity when the generals of the king were at a loss as to how to deal with the situation. They taught them not to engage the Spartans on land but at sea, because if they prevailed in this way, Greece would also share in this victory. The plan of Conon and Evagoras would benefit not only Persia, but also the whole of Hellas. But Isocrates does not identify the Persian generals, in reality Pharnabazus. This did not matter for Isocrates, who remains focused on Conon and Evagoras and what ensued. The two men were persuasive because the Persian generals accepted their advice and organized the fleet. The Spartans were utterly defeated at sea and lost their supremacy. The Greeks were freed, and Athens received part of the ancient glory and became leaders of the allies. Isocrates points out that this was accomplished because Conon was the general, although Evagoras had some share in this and provided most of the military force. Isocrates avoids saying that Pharnabazus was in charge of the Persian fleet and gives the impression that the Persian generals followed Conon's lead. Isocrates then says that the Athenians erected statues of Conon and Evagoras near the statue of Zeus and near each other as a memorial of their deeds. This is the first time that an orator mentions their statues and defines their location. On the other hand, he still did not want to name Cnidus and connect it explicitly with Conon. He says that Evagoras contributed the majority of the resources to the naval battle at Cnidus. From this success, the king became lord of all Asia. The Spartans were forced to fight over their own territory instead of ravaging Asia. The Greeks achieved autonomy instead of slavery, and the Athenians increased so much that those who previously ruled them came to offer them the empire. The result of the battle had the benefits that Conon and Evagoras had promised to the Persians. The Spartans were the losers, while the king, the allies, and Athens were the real winners. Demosthenes, in his speech against Leptines, mentions Conon's victory at Cnidus. This event belonged to the Middle Past. It had taken place 40 years ago, at a time when the elders had lived and could retell it to the young who did not know it. Demosthenes acknowledges that Conon had served in the Persian fleet, but he says nothing about the negotiations with him or that he had served under Pharnabazus. Instead, he alleges that Conon acted on his own, since he had received no support from Athens and utterly defeated the Lacedaemonians. Moreover, he does not name Cnidus. This is a conflict between Athens and Sparta. Then Demosthenes praises Conon because he returned to Athens, restored the walls, and became the first to make the hegemony of Greece once more the subject of dispute between Athens and Sparta. Demosthenes insists so much on the benefits on the allies that he chooses to mention the first line of the decree that the Athenians had inscribed in his honor. Moreover, he repeats, like Isocrates, that the Athenians had erected a statue for Conon, and implies that he was honored by the people of Erythrae. Finally, he considers Conon superior to Themistocles, because the former rebuilt the walls after defeating the Spartans in battle, while the latter had tricked the Spartans, overlooking the fact that in 479-78 the Spartans, though opposed to the prospect of Athens' refortification, were still formally allied to Athens, while in 394 they were at war. In Against Androtion, Demosthenes makes a comparison between Conon's victory against Sparta and the present situation in order to accuse his adversary Androtion, who destroyed the crowns which brought prestigious inscriptions on them. Demosthenes claims that Androtion obliterated one inscription which said Conon from the naval battle with the Lacedaemonians. Demosthenes repeats the same tactic in Against Timocrates. He refers to public inscriptions and assumes that the jurors used to see the words written under the circlets of the crowns, one of which said Conon from the naval battle with the Lacedaemonians. Isocrates eulogizes Conon in his Areopagiticus. He boasts that all Greece was in control of Athens after Conon's naval battle and Timotheus' generalship. Isocrates makes a shortcut and connects Conon's victory at Cnidus with the naval operations of 370. Then he says that when Conon was victorious fighting in the sea, ambassadors came from Sparta and gave the city the mastery of the sea. Isocrates does not name Cnidus and presents this as a Panhellenic victory, since Athens controlled Greece. Moreover, he lies about Sparta, since the discussion was about the negotiations with Persia. Moreover, Isocrates wrote a letter to the oligarchs who ruled Mytilene in Lesbos, requesting the safe return of Agenor, who had been a teacher of his grandchildren. In these, he mentioned Conon and Timotheus because he thought that they would be influential to some Greeks. Isocrates justifies his request by saying that if the two men were alive now, they would be very eager for him to get what he asks. Isocrates takes for granted that the oligarchs of Mytilene knew the achievement of Conon and his son, so he did not mention anything else. Cnidus was not mentioned, but Isocrates' argument can be justified if the Mytileneans remembered positively Conon's liberation of the islanders from Sparta. Into Philip, Isocrates claims that when Conon saw that Agesilaus was pillaging Asia, he was so dauntless of spirit that although he had no resource except for his body and wheat, he hoped to conquer the Spartans who were leaders of Greek. Thus, he sent words to the generals of the king, promising to do this. Then he defeated the Spartans in a naval battle, removed them from their command, and freed the Greeks. Finally, he rebuilt the walls and brought his city back to the high repute from which it had fallen. The fortune of Greece was reserved by Conon. Isocrates pretends that Conon approached the king after Agesilaus' arrival in Asia and not in 398. He justifies Conon's use of Persian money by saying that he only hoped to defeat the Spartans for the sake of Athens. He omits to say that the king agreed to his plan and that he cooperated with Pharnabazus. He presents Conon as leading the Persian fleet alone, presents the battle as his own victory, and alleges that Conon freed the Greeks as if Pharnabazus was not with him all this time. This is a conflict between Athens and Sparta. Finally, he omits to say that Conon rebuilt the walls with Persian money. There seems to be an exception to this trend. Conon's victory at Cnidus should not be named in the assembly. In the fourth Philippic, Demosthenes proposed that Athens should send an embassy to the king. He knew that the Athenians would not be happy with his idea, so he says that nobody should be afraid of him and speak badly about him because he had helped in putting the city's affairs back in order. Demosthenes focuses on the king, talks about him positively, and presents his offer to the Athenians as the result of cooperation between him and someone else, Conon, whom he does not name. This passage was quite obscure to Demosthenes' readers. Didymos argues that Demosthenes alluded to Conon's Persian-sponsored defeat of the Spartans at Cnidus. Moreover, he notes that Demosthenes implies that with the preparation of Pharnabazus, Conon succeeded with him to totally defeat the Lacedaemonians in the naval battle at Cnidus. Aeschylus also says that the king who restored the city's affairs with one more man was Conon, and he did so because of his naval battle at Cnidus. Demosthenes chose not to name Conon as other orators had done after the battle, but he believed that some of his listeners could have known about Conon's success through their ancestors. On the other hand, he did not feel comfortable to talk about Conon's victory through the king's help. The other orators continued to praise Conon. In the Panathinaikos, Isocrates, speaking against the Spartans, maintains that when they were utterly defeated at sea by the king's force and Conon's generalship, they made the peace of Antalcidas. Isocrates repeats the argument from the Vagoras that the Spartans were utterly defeated at Cnidus. Moreover, he acknowledges that the fleet belonged to the king, but he presents it as if Conon was his general. The impression is that the victory at Cnidus was the result of a direct cooperation between the king and Conon. Then, Isocrates alleges that the result of this victory was the despicable peace of Antalcidas, which the Spartans brought to the Greek world. Isocrates insists on the relationship between the king and the Spartans and says that when the king utterly defeated them at Cnidus, he humbled them, so they handed over to him a big part of him and of all Asia. The king's victory is overwhelming. However, Isocrates does not name Cnidus, passes by Conon's role in the negotiations with Persia, and presents the peace as the result of a relationship between the king and Sparta. In Against Philippides, Hyperides praises Conon because he became responsible for fine things for both Athens and the Greeks. In 382, Dinarchus exploits Conon's deed to denigrate Demosthenes for the Harpalos affair. He praises Timotheus, who sailed around the Peloponnese and defeated the Lacedaemonians, and identifies him as the son of Conon, who freed the Greeks. Almost 50 years after Isocrates Evagoras, where it was said that Conon and Evagoras had freed the Greeks, Dinarchus repeats partly this argument by omitting Evagoras' role but praising Conon. Moreover, he repeats almost 23 years after Demosthenes against Leptines the concept that Conon liberated the allies of the Greeks. Since Conon's statue was placed near the statue of Zeus Eleftherios, Dinarchus could repeat the argument that Conon freed the Greeks because the Athenian could still see Conon's statue. Then he claims that Demosthenes compared his deeds to those of Timotheus and Conon, who had benefited the Athenians. For him, the jurors should not compare Demosthenes to those whose deeds were worthy of the city and their ancestors. No other orator claims that Conon looked at the future generations of Athenians, but such a claim allowed Dinarchus to make the Athenians imagine themselves as descendants of a glorious past. In 174-75, Dinarchus boasts that Athens was great, held in high esteem by the Greeks and worthy of their ancestors, and among these deeds from the past is that Conon, so the elders saw, won victory at the naval battle of Cnidus. Lysias in his funeral speech and Isocrates in his Panegyricus called the battle at Cnidus a Persian victory. Later on, Isocrates treated the battle at Cnidus as Conon's personal victory in the Areopagiticus and Philip. Almost 80 years after Cnidus, this event belonged to the distant past for the common Athenians, so they could know about it through oral tradition. Conon was the victor of the Spartans. Dinarchus follows the main trend and claims that although the democracy had been subverted by the Spartans in the past, she was made the leading power of Greece again thanks to the generals of the kind that Dinarchus mentioned earlier, among them Conon, who was included among the glorious generals of the past. Nobody remembered that Conon was not an Athenian commander at that time. Dinarchus believed that this argument about Conon would be effective because in Against Philocles, who was also involved in the Harpalos affair, he duplicates what he had said in Against Demosthenes and praises Conon's son Timotheus and Conon himself for freeing the Greeks. Conclusion. Conon's battle at Cnidus, his service in the Persian fleet with Pharnabazus, and rebuilding of the wall with the king's money are mentioned in the orators for almost 70 years, and his image develops from negative to positive in the course of time. After Cnidus, the orator, except for Polycrates, alluded to Conon's victory in a negative way, did not want to name the place of the battle, and paid little or no importance to the rebuilding of the walls. After 350, the orators reinterpreted Cnidus and its results differently. Although they did not deny that Conon had served in Persia's navy, they saw the Battle of Cnidus as a conflict between Athens and Sparta, through which they utterly defeated their enemy, reclaimed the city's leading role in the Hellenic affairs, stopped Spartan dominations, and freed the Greeks. At the end of this rhetorical process, Conon's achievement became a mode of recollection, topos, which directed social memory. The man was remembered as the liberator of the Greeks. Thank you.
Thank you.